Hi, and welcome to the Bruce channel. I'm Bruce. So we have this wide open gun thing. Wide open gun laws all over the country. We talk about some curbs, maybe some background checks, making sure you're not crazy, or not allowing assault rifles, or not allowing internet or gun show sales without background checks. We talk about it. But until we do more than talk, we'll keep getting the same results. Definition of crazy? Of course, only a few of those things could have changed anything in the Las Vegas massacre. The shooter this time gave no warning, no signals, didn't appear to be crazy. He would have passed a background check flying colors. He didn't visit the websites of hate groups. He left no note as to what motivated him, so we may never know why he hated people so much whom he had never met that he fired indiscriminately into a crowd of people. And thus he became the largest mass murderer in our history before apparently killing himself. We may never know. But one of those things I mentioned, changing the kinds of weapons available to the public, would have changed things in Las Vegas. Maybe instead of 58, it would have been 28 or 8. When you can shoot 400 to 800 rounds a minute into a crowd, you don't have to be a very good shot. And until we change things, it will happen again and again and again and again and again. We'll be horrified and mortified, and our thoughts and prayers will go out, and then it'll happen again and again and again. The NRA and the other gun lobbyists say that it's their right, it's our right to own a gun. Bill O'Reilly said that it's the price of freedom. That's bullshit. There's freedom in Canada, there's freedom in Belgium, Germany, and yes, shootings can happen elsewhere. It's been a few years, but there was a mass shooting in Norway, of all places, some years ago. And see what I said? Norway had a mass shooting a few years ago. We have one almost every day. The definition is 4 or more being shot, and we have one almost every day. Almost as many of those as the day of the year we're on. And we don't even hear about most of them unless it happens near where we live. Here, only here, is the price of freedom being at risk of being shot up in the most benign settings imaginable. So I think it's worth once again examining what the Second Amendment says. The most conservative viewpoint of the Constitution, the views held by the most zealots, the originalists, like former Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia and current Justices Clarence Thomas and the new kid on the block, Scalia's replacement, Neil Gorsuch. The Constitution is to be interpreted exactly as the framers wrote it. The opposing view is that the Constitution is a living document. I'm not an originalist, why in a moment, but if you're extremely conservative, if the words can only be interpreted as written, then you have to notice this. Before the right to keep and bear arms is mentioned, first mentioned is a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well regulated. So if you're a civilian and you drill and train regularly with your state's militia, analogous, say, to the National Guard, then yeah, you can keep and bear arms. Oh, and if it's well regulated, then the regulations might also include which arms you might keep and bear. Otherwise, no. That is what the framers said. Which is the point that I'm not an originalist. The Constitution is a living thing. How do I know? Because the framers, the guys who wrote it and then ratified it, like Amos Singletary, whom I played for the PBS special, The American Constitution, those guys told us it was a living document. They did so plainly and clearly. They did so when they wrote in the Constitution how to change the Constitution, that is, how to make amendments. It is a living document. The framers said so. Now, I think, too, it's reasonable to consider when they wrote it, when they wrote it, there were muskets, front-loading muskets, about a shot a minute if you were really fast, maybe 3. I doubt that the framers could have imagined a technology that would allow a crazy non-member of a well-regulated militia to fire 400 to 800 rounds a minute into a crowd of people from hundreds of yards away. It's interesting to note that a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Burger, a conservative Republican, appointed by Republican Richard Nixon, said that the Second Amendment has been, and I quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public, by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime, end of quote. Special interests, the NRA, the gun manufacturing lobbies, round up the usual suspects. There are no other suspects. I said I'm not an originalist, and I'm not a jurist, but honestly, how can anyone, jurist or not, be an originalist? The Constitution doesn't say anything at all about telegraphs. They didn't exist. And telegraphs led to telephony and radio and television, and no one is bummed out because there's an FCC. Without an FCC, you couldn't turn on the radio or well, you could, but it wouldn't do you any good because it would just be babble. Without awarding specific frequencies at specific wattages to licensed stations, it would be babble. Turn on 93.5 on your FM dial, and everybody with a tower could compete to be heard. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's the opening from the other venerated document those guys produced. I'm not saying ban all guns, but assault weapons aren't any good for hunting, so it seems self-evident to me, and I can't imagine how it's not to everyone else, that if we just allow anyone to have any kind and any number of these things, and to purposely then conflate that with other messages, the hate mongers shout, that, if you're like us, great, and if you're different, then you're evil, and thus the worth of those lives aren't as important as ours. I'm not a physicist either, and so far at least I've been played one on TV, but I do understand the principle of critical mass, not in the span of a year or a decade or even a generation, but the frequency of mass shootings, beginning perhaps with the clock tower at the University of Texas in 1966. They have increased in frequency. And to that add us and them hate speech. If hate speech is the splitter, and if a mass shooting is a splitting atom, then one hits another, causes more hate speech and more shootings and copycats. I'm just thinking out loud here in a sort of abstract way. In other words, if we don't work to control the fissions, we don't work to put the tubes back in, might we not risk, metaphorically, the ultimate chain reaction that tears away the fabric of our society? Where we do finally end up in a sci-fi dystopian culture?
Hey, let me tell you about my book, Shrink. For most of my adult life, I weighed a little over 100 pounds, not much more than in this picture taken when I was about 17 and considering becoming a jockey. But as is often true, once I crossed into my 40s, extra weight came, and it stayed. For years, I tried to lose, instead gained, and ended up 153 pounds. And I'm embarrassed to show you this video. Then I learned that it isn't about calories and exercise, but instead it's about what you eat. You might say, sure, ice cream makes you fat. But there were surprises, things like orange juice not being such a wise choice if you're trying to lose weight. So I just made some basic changes to what I ate, not how much, and the weight just fell off. Now, nearly 3 years later, it is still off. And don't misunderstand, I'm eating foods I like, not bamboo shoots. Friends ask me how I did it so often, I put it in a book. It's available as an ebook for all platforms, and the print edition is available at barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com. Hey, you can shrink too.
And I got some mail from viewers last week who took offense at my characterizing Republicans as whores at the teat of health insurers. Actually, the NRA is a bigger corruptive force than the health insurers, but let me be clear, not all Republicans are bad. But what is broken in our government is that there are cowards who call themselves Republicans. There's really 3 parties. And the smallest faction, the so-called Freedom Caucus, the hard right, they're in the minority. outnumbering them are the real Republicans who are willing to work among themselves and with Democratic colleagues. So, find give and take, find a compromise that each might accept. But those hard writers, they hate the more moderate fellow Republicans just as much as they do the Democrats. But because they're a minority, they hold on to the party label of Republican so that they can be part of a majority. And then they're like a kid with a tantrum, screaming if they can't get everything all their way. I spoke last week of Roy Moore, who won the Republican primary for the Senate in Alabama. He hates the Republicans in Congress and has said so. I call that kind of Republican a coward. They know they're too far out for most people. If they weren't cowards, they'd form their own party and campaign on their beliefs, but they know they'd win few elections, so they keep calling themselves Republicans. They're a small minority, but they hold everyone hostage. One last note about health insurance. I'm sure you heard about the terrible irony. Actress Julia Louis-Dreyfus, nearly 2 weeks ago, won her 6th consecutive Emmy. That's unprecedented. The following day, she learned that she has breast cancer. Her statement, put out on Thursday of that week, said, "1 in 8 women get breast cancer. Today, I'm the one. The good news is that I have the most glorious group of supportive and caring family and friends and fantastic insurance through my union. The bad news is that not all women are so lucky, so let's fight all cancers and make universal health care a reality." So the next day, 2 Fridays ago, Megyn Kelly, still in the first days of her new show, Megyn Kelly Today, opened her show by pointing out the irony of Julia's week, the best of times and worst of times. And she read Julia's statement. But she shortchanged Julia Louis-Dreyfus, whose point, I think it's fair to say, was to underscore that she thinks everyone ought to have equal health care. Well, that's not what Megyn did. Megyn stopped after, "I have the most glorious group of supportive and caring family and friends. That's so true. We do need to be loving and supporting," or some such. She purposely omitted the very point the actress was trying to make. It was a disgusting misappropriation of her statement. I guess you can take the woman out of the fox, but you can't take the fox out of the woman. Welcome back. Remember, you can write to us at the Bruce Channel at yahoo.com. You can watch all of our previous shows either at our Facebook page or at tinyurl.com/Bruce Channel. I don't know if you watched any of the President's Cup last week. If you don't know, the President's Cup is a golf event. It alternates with the Ryder Cup. The Ryder Cup is much older. For years, every other year, the Ryder Cup was played by a team of Americans against a team of British golfers. And they alternated. An English course, next time an American course. But what happened is the U.S. was a lot bigger, obviously, a much bigger pool of contestants, and the Brits rarely won. So, a number of years ago, they made it the U.S. against European golfers. And now, the Yanks were challenged, sometimes losing the event several times in a row. And then once it became competitive, the ratings grew enormously. Seeing that, the idea was born, gee, how can we do more of this? Easy. Yanks against European is one thing, but Australian golfer Greg Norman wasn't ever eligible. So how about the U.S. against a team of golfers from around the world minus Europe? And it was scheduled for the other year and the every other year that the Ryder Cup was played. Well, even if you don't give a flip about golf, and I admit I wasn't even paying attention to it. I didn't know it was being played. Wow. I just happened to see it. When I discovered it, not the golf. Americans almost clinched it on Saturday, so it was boring, but I'd never heard of Liberty National Golf Club. It's fairly new. It only opened 11 years ago. What elicited the wow was it was built on a former landfill in Jersey City, New Jersey, just across the water. Yeah. On some holes, you're shooting at the World Trade Center. On some, you're walking near the Statue of Liberty. I've officially begun a bucket list. I'd like to play that course once. Oh, and in sports news, other sports news, postseason baseball is now in full swing. Wow, Friday. Friday was like March Madness. There were baseball all day and all night. I imagine lots of sick days were taken. Cleveland has never in my lifetime looked so good. Do I mean the team? Do I mean the city? Take your pick, yeah. At my deadline, the outcome of any of the series remains unknown, but my Indians won the first game 4-0 against the Yankees in a contest that wasn't even as close as the score sounds. They were dominant. And in game 2, they won an incredible game. 13 innings. They were behind at one point, 8-3. They came back to tie it, took it to the 13th inning, a walk-off. It was almost as good a game as the 6th game of the 75 World Series. Yeah, almost. Wow. All right, go try it. Oh, speaking of Cleveland baseball, some of you, even if you're not from Cleveland, may recall the film called Major League. It featured a group of ragtag players, ne'er-do-wells, who suddenly found themselves doing well. But the movie was decades ago, so what are they doing now? Don't know for most of them, but ace reliever Rick Vaughn, well, he was really a lousy reliever until they discovered he needed glasses. And then he became their ace reliever, known as Wild Thing. Yeah, but as I said, that was almost 30 years ago. Surely he's not still pitching. Nope. I recently discovered that, like me, he's no longer in Cleveland. This is about 100 yards from my house. All right, so a couple of quickies before we go. There's Hurricane Nate. It's not a super major one, but it might be heading this way. Not the center, but we'll get some rain apparently, and we need it. The last rain we had was from Hurricane Irma, and it wasn't much, and that's weeks ago. And even though it may not become a major hurricane, if you're near the Gulf Coast, you can still get flooded because, you're near the Gulf Coast, you're at sea level. Another quickie. I officially have an azalea bush that's gone rogue. It blooms in the spring in concert with the others, but the third year in a row, it's blooming in the fall. It's just begun. And in my memory, it's also done it previously in November or December, so I don't know, it's a little schizophrenia. That fall blooming doesn't amount to a lot, but has anyone else ever heard of this? Strange. All right, days of the week this week. Well, today is National Pierogi Day. Yeah, another reason to celebrate Cleveland. Tomorrow is Columbus Day, at least the official Columbus Day is tomorrow. The banks will be closed. There won't be mail. But tomorrow is also Curious Events Day, which strikes me as apropos. One thing that strikes me as rather curious is that Columbus is credited with having discovered America. But how does that work exactly? There were millions of people all across North America, for that matter, South America. America was already discovered. Didn't they discover it? And so what can only be considered a bittersweet irony, tomorrow is also Native American Day. Curiouser and curiouser. Oh, and it's great for baseball. or football, beer and pizza day, which certainly makes more sense than Columbus Day. Tuesday is Hug a Drummer Day. Now, you might know that my main instrument is piano, but you may not know that I do play other instruments, including drums. Just saying. Wednesday is Take Your Parents to Lunch Day. Would that I could. Friday, in addition to being Triskaidekaphobia Day, is World Egg Day. And, I'm not making this up, folks, it is also No Bra Day. And that's a holiday that I can get behind. Or in front of. All right, so from front to back and all in between, I do hope that your upcoming week is the best one you've ever had.